"Don't you want to try the coffee I made just for you, darling?" Ethan said, his voice tinged with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. It was a polite offer, but there was something off about the way he said it. His lips curled up in a way that seemed almost too practiced, like he was waiting for a response, but not really interested in my answer. I forced a smile, sitting at the end of the long dining table in my sister-in-law Rachel's immaculately arranged kitchen. The rich mahogany furniture, the gleaming silverware, all of it looked as perfect as a scene from a lifestyle magazine. But beneath the surface, something didn't sit right. I looked down at the steaming cup of coffee in front of me. The scent hit me first. Something wasn't quite right about it. It wasn't the familiar, warm, comforting aroma I'd come to expect from a freshly brewed cup. No, this smelled wrong. Metallic, almost with an undertone that reminded me of something unnatural, something chemical. My stomach churned as I stared at it, my fingers curling around the handle without lifting it to my lips. I didn't want to be rude. I never did. But the thought of drinking that cup made my gut tighten. I had learned over the years to trust my instincts, and something about that smell didn't sit right with me. "How thoughtful of you," I replied, forcing the smile to stay on my lips even though my mind raced. Working through the thought of why Ethan would make me a cup of coffee at all today, why he was so insistent, and why Rachel wasn't looking at me. She was watching us, but her eyes seemed empty, detached, as if she knew something I didn't, something that made my heart beat a little faster. Rachel's voice cut through the moment. "Ethan's been experimenting with different brewing methods," she said, a sly smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "All just for you, of course." The emphasis she placed on "just for you" made my spine stiffen, the cold chill creeping up my neck. Was that a joke? Or was there something else behind it? I glanced at Ethan, his eyes flickering for just a second as if he were waiting for my reaction. But then they quickly returned to the overly calm demeanor that had become so familiar. I didn't want to think the worst. Not yet. But I couldn't shake the feeling, the familiar feeling of something being off, something being planned. Ethan had been spending more time at Rachel's house lately, always working on a surprise for our anniversary, he'd said. But the whispers that stopped as soon as I entered the room, the hushed conversations behind closed doors, the strange looks exchanged between the two of them, those were the things I couldn't ignore anymore. And now this coffee. It didn't smell right, and I had learned the hard way that when things didn't feel right, it was never just a coincidence. I took a deep breath, glancing at Rachel again. She hadn't moved, still sitting with her own untouched cup of coffee, stirring it absently as if there was nothing to worry about. Her presence was almost calming, but that only made the unease gnaw at me even harder. What was she hiding? What were they hiding? The silence between us stretched on for a moment, thick with unspoken words. I lifted the cup slowly, pretending to bring it to my lips, but I didn't sip it. Not yet. I needed more time, more observations. My mind raced, piecing together fragments of conversations and odd occurrences. Like the time last month when I had ended up at the urgent care clinic after drinking tea at Rachel's house. The doctors couldn't explain it, but I knew. I had felt the same odd discomfort then too, something in the tea, something in the way Rachel had served it. And now the same feeling creeping back in. I set the cup down gently, making sure to let my fingers hover just above the rim so the metallic smell wouldn't cling to my skin. I glanced at Ethan, watching his face for any signs, any flicker of guilt or deception, but his expression was as neutral as ever. That bothered me more than anything else. "You know, Rachel," I said, trying to sound casual as I kept my gaze fixed on Ethan. "I noticed Ethan's been brewing a lot of coffee lately. Are you sure it's as good as he says? I've never had such an intense scent coming from a cup before." My voice was light, playful even, but underneath it, I could feel my pulse quicken. Every word was carefully chosen. Every glance, every movement was calculated. I didn't want to tip my hand too soon. Rachel's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. It was so quick I wasn't sure if I imagined it, but the fleeting change in her demeanor only deepened my suspicion. She shifted in her seat, finally glancing up from her coffee, her expression unreadable. "It's just coffee, I'm sure," she replied, her voice clipped. No need to overthink things. She looked at Ethan then, and for the briefest moment, their eyes locked, intense, calculating, and somehow too familiar. The silence stretched again, but now it was heavier, thicker with the weight of 1,000 things unsaid. I needed to figure out what was going on. I couldn't just sit here and wait. Something was wrong, and I had to get to the bottom of it. The questions kept swirling in my mind as I watched Rachel carefully. Was she involved? Had she known all along? I couldn't be sure, but the subtle changes in her behavior, the way she was stirring her coffee without even noticing, told me she wasn't as innocent as she looked. I placed my hand on the table, leaning in just slightly, and gave a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "How thoughtful of you, really?" I repeated, my voice betraying none of the turmoil in my chest. "But I think I'll pass on the coffee today. Maybe next time, when it's brewed the usual way." Rachel chuckled, but the sound was forced. "Sure, of course." But her eyes didn't leave me, and in that moment, I could have sworn I saw a flicker of something dark behind those perfectly composed eyes. A moment of recognition, something that told me I wasn't wrong. My hand gripped the cup again, lifting it just a little higher, my fingers brushing the edge. It was time, but the more I thought about it, the more the metallic scent gnawed at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a simple cup of coffee. It never was. Not with them. As I sat there, trying to pretend that everything was fine, the weight of the coffee cup in my hand felt like it was slowly sinking into my skin. It wasn't heavy, not in the traditional sense, but it was loaded with something far more unnerving. My fingers pressed into the ceramic, the metallic scent lingering in the air around me. I forced my mind to focus on the conversation, on the polite words floating between us, but my thoughts kept drifting back to that strange cup of coffee. Every time I glanced at Ethan, my unease grew. He was too calm. His smile was too practiced. He had been so careful this morning, so deliberate in his gestures. Why? The strange tension between him and Rachel hadn't gone unnoticed. I wasn't blind to the subtle way they exchanged glances, or how they seemed to communicate without speaking. At first, I had chalked it up to familiarity, maybe even a shared sense of humor that I didn't quite understand. But the longer I sat there, the more I began to realize that their camaraderie wasn't born out of family connection. It was born out of something darker, something that I had never seen in the brief moments they'd allowed me to witness. Rachel leaned back in her chair, swirling her coffee absent-mindedly. The calmness of her posture only made me more suspicious. I had known her long enough to recognize the signs of discomfort, but she was too good at hiding it, too good at pretending that everything was normal. She met my gaze, and for a split second, I saw it, the flicker of something cold behind her eyes. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there. My mind was racing. What was going on between them? What were they planning? I couldn't focus on the conversation anymore. Ethan's voice felt distant, as though it was coming from a place far outside this house. I could see his lips moving, but the words no longer made sense. My head was full of questions, and I needed answers. I had learned from experience that when something felt off, it usually wasn't. But this was different. The smell of that coffee, the way Rachel had responded to my comment about Ethan's brewing methods, and the way they both seemed to be watching me with such quiet intensity. It was all connected. It wasn't just a coincidence anymore. Before I could stop myself, I took a long breath and let the words escape. "Ethan, I've been thinking about something. About all these strange moments. These accidents. The tea last month. The breakfast last week. All those times I've been sick after spending time here. Don't you think it's all a little too much to ignore?" His face didn't change. He kept his smile, though I could see the faintest flicker of something in his eyes. Fear? Guilt? Or was it just that he knew I was getting too close? I watched him, waiting for him to speak. But instead, Rachel responded, her voice smooth and steady. "Oh, come on. It's just bad luck. You've had a few rough days, that's all. Nothing to worry about." I wanted to argue, to tell her that it wasn't bad luck. But something in her voice told me it wasn't just denial. It was the same tone she'd used when she reassured me that everything was fine the last time I'd been sick. The same tone I'd heard when I thought everything was normal, only to wake up in a hospital bed with no explanation for what had happened. I'd learned not to trust that voice. I shifted uncomfortably in my chair, trying to steady my breathing. My thoughts were racing, trying to connect the dots, trying to make sense of the strange puzzle that was slowly unfolding. But every time I thought I had it figured out, something else popped up to make me doubt myself. Was I paranoid? Was I overthinking it? Or was there something much darker at play? And then it hit me. The whispers. The subtle way Rachel and Ethan had been acting around me for the past few weeks. The sudden, unexplained absences. The shared glances when I wasn't looking. The way their voices would drop to a hushed tone whenever I entered a room. It wasn't just me. I had felt it too many times. The feeling that I wasn't wanted. The feeling that something was being kept from me. I'd ignored it, pushed it aside, but now I couldn't ignore it anymore. The walls they'd built around themselves were starting to crack, and I could see it clearly now. I took a deep breath, looking at my phone, pretending to check for work emails. I needed a moment to collect myself. My hand hovered over the coffee cup once more, but I stopped myself before I could bring it to my lips. I couldn't do it, not yet. My stomach churned at the thought. Instead, I focused on the steady hum of conversation. Rachel and Ethan were still talking, but their words seemed less important now. What mattered was the growing sense of dread in my chest, the creeping feeling that something was terribly wrong. Before I share what happened next, the moment that made everything click and left my entire world spinning, I want to connect with you, my amazing viewers. Where are you watching from? Drop your country's flag in the comments below, and share your thoughts on what you think might happen next. Have you ever had a gut feeling that you couldn't shake, no matter how hard you tried? If so, hit that like button, because this story is just getting started, and I'm about to tell you everything. I turned my attention back to the table, watching as Rachel pushed her coffee cup aside, her fingers nervously tapping the edge. She was hiding something, I knew it. The tension in the room had shifted, and it wasn't just my imagination. I was starting to see the signs clearly now, and the reality of what might be happening hit me like a cold wave. Everything all right? Ethan's voice broke through the fog of my thoughts, pulling my attention back to him. His smile was still there, but this time it seemed strained, forced. There was something different in the way he looked at me, something I couldn't put my finger on. Was it guilt? Or something worse? I smiled back, though the smile didn't reach my eyes. I'm fine, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But as the words left my lips, I knew deep down that I wasn't fine. None of this was fine. Rachel tilted her head slightly, her gaze flickering from Ethan to me. If you're not feeling well, maybe you should rest, she suggested, her voice almost too sweet. But the edge in her tone was unmistakable. She was trying to be subtle, but the warning was there, and it wasn't lost on me. I wanted to say something. I wanted to ask her what she knew. I wanted to demand the truth, but the words caught in my throat. Something told me that if I pushed too hard, too soon, I might be walking straight into the trap they had set for me. I wasn't ready to make that mistake. Not yet. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours, and as I sat there, I realized something. I had already started to fight back. I wasn't just going to sit here and wait for whatever was coming next. No, I was going to find the truth, and I was going to expose it, no matter the cost. The next part of the story is when everything starts to unfold, when the truth starts to come out, and the pieces of this twisted puzzle begin to fit together. Keep watching, because you're not going to believe what happens next. The atmosphere around the table was thick with unspoken words, each moment stretching out just a little too long. My fingers drummed lightly against the side of the coffee cup, the only sound in the room other than the faint clink of silverware against plates. Ethan and Rachel continued their casual conversation, but I could feel it, the tension simmering just beneath the surface, growing stronger with every passing second. I tried to focus on the conversation, to force myself to believe that everything was fine. But the nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach refused to let go. Every time I glanced at Ethan, I saw something different in his eyes. something that didn't belong. His usual warmth, the affection that had once been so comforting, had faded. In its place was something cold, distant, almost calculating. And Rachel, she was no better. Her usual calm demeanor had shifted, replaced by a subtle unease that I hadn't seen before. There was something happening here, something I couldn't ignore anymore. I had spent far too many years trusting them, believing in the picture-perfect life we had built together. But that image was cracking, the pieces falling away one by one, leaving the ugly truth behind. I had to face it. I wasn't just being paranoid. I wasn't overthinking things. What was happening now was real, and it was dangerous. The conversation around me seemed to blur into the background as my mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. My thoughts circled back to the coffee, the metallic taste that lingered in my mouth, the odd, almost chemical scent that seemed to haunt me. What was in that coffee? What was in the food? I had known for a while now that something was off, but this was the first time it had hit me this hard. The pieces were all there, scattered before me like a puzzle I had yet to solve. I glanced at Rachel again. She was stirring her coffee, her movements slow and deliberate. She hadn't taken a sip. Neither had Ethan, for that matter. They were both watching me closely, almost as though they were waiting for something to happen. A sudden realization hit me. They weren't just watching me. They were watching for my reaction. They knew. They knew I was starting to see through the facade they had worked so hard to create. Suddenly, my mind flashed back to the last few weeks, to the subtle changes in their behavior. Ethan had been distant, more so than usual. He had become preoccupied with work, spending long hours at the office, staying late to finish projects that seemed to never end. I had tried to ignore it at first, chalking it up to stress or work pressure. But the whispers, the late-night phone calls when I was half asleep, and the secretive texts that I had caught glimpses of when his phone was left unattended, they couldn't be ignored any longer. Rachel had been no better. She had become colder, more distant, and there was an air of hostility between us that I couldn't quite place. We had always gotten along well, or at least that's what I had believed. But now, every time I saw her, I felt a shift in the air, an undercurrent of something I couldn't understand. Her comments, the way she would smile a little too sweetly, the way she would brush off my concerns with a few too many reassurances. All of it felt like a carefully crafted performance. And now, this coffee. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was part of the plan. Test, maybe. A way to see how far they could push me before I would snap, before I would start to question everything. Was this just a cruel game? Or was there something more sinister at play? I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor, breaking the silence that had settled over the table. I needed to think, to get out of this suffocating room for a moment, but I couldn't just leave. Not yet. I glanced down at the coffee cup one last time, then at Ethan and Rachel. Both of them were watching me closely, their expressions unreadable. They knew something I didn't. I could feel it. "I need a minute," I said, my voice shaking just slightly as I turned toward the door. I didn't wait for a response, just walked out of the room, my mind racing with questions. I needed space to breathe, to clear my head. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, and every step I took seemed to echo in the empty hallway. But there was no escape. Not from the reality I was facing, not from the truth I was slowly uncovering. I walked into the study, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the air conditioner. I leaned against the desk, trying to steady my breathing, but my mind refused to slow down. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that everything I had trusted was slipping through my fingers. But as I stood there, trying to make sense of it all, a thought struck me. What if this wasn't just about me? What if this was about something bigger? About the power, the control, the manipulation that Ethan and Rachel had over me. Had they been planning this all along? Were they trying to break me down, to make me question everything I knew? Or was I simply a pawn in a much larger game? I glanced back toward the dining room, my mind racing with the possibilities. I needed to know what they were planning. I needed to understand how deep this went. I couldn't just sit back and let them continue to control the narrative. If I was going to survive this, I had to take action. I had to find the truth, no matter how painful it might be. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. I had already made up my mind. I wasn't going to let them win. Not this time. I turned back toward the door, but as I stepped toward it, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. Who was it? Ethan? Rachel? Or someone else? I didn't know, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was about to happen, it was going to change everything. As I turned, I saw Rachel standing in the doorway. Her face was a mask of calm, but her eyes, those eyes were cold, calculating, and full of something far darker than I had ever seen before. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls were closing in around me. Rachel's presence in the doorway was like a barrier, a reminder that I was no longer in control of my own space. My pulse quickened as I looked at her, her expression unreadable. Was she here to confront me? To stop me from discovering whatever it was they were hiding? I couldn't tell, but one thing was certain. I couldn't back down now. Rachel stepped into the room, the soft click of the door closing behind her the only sound breaking the silence. She stood there for a moment, her eyes never leaving mine, as if waiting for me to speak first. I tried to steady my breathing, to push down the growing sense of panic. But the more I looked at her, the more I saw through the carefully constructed facade she had built around herself. She was nervous. I could see it in the way she held herself, in the tightness of her jaw. It was as if she was trying to hide something, something I wasn't supposed to know. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the air thick with tension. I wanted to say something, to demand the truth, but my mind was still racing, still trying to piece together the fragments of what had been happening. I had to be careful. I couldn't let her know that I was onto her. Not yet. I didn't think you'd be the type to run off like that, Rachel finally said, her voice smooth, but there was a hint of something sharper beneath it. Everything okay? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I glanced toward the hallway, wondering if Ethan was about to come in, if he was going to try to stop me from figuring out the truth. I had a feeling he was close, maybe just waiting for the right moment to intervene. Couldn't let him. I couldn't let either of them dictate the narrative anymore. This was my life, my truth, and I was going to uncover it, no matter the cost. I just needed a moment, I said, my voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside me. To think. Rachel's eyes softened, but only for a second. Her gaze flickered toward the door, as if she was considering whether or not to leave me alone. But then her expression hardened again. You've been acting strange lately, she said, the words hanging heavy in the air between us. You're overthinking things, Rachel. You always do. I caught the slight shift in her tone. The way she said my name was almost too familiar, too intimate. Sent a chill down my spine. She knew what I was up to. She could tell that I was starting to put the pieces together. And in that moment, I realized that I couldn't wait anymore. I had to act. Without thinking, I reached for the coffee cup sitting on the desk beside me, my fingers brushing against the rim. Rachel didn't move. She watched me, her eyes calculating. She knew what I was doing. She must have. But I wasn't going to let her control the situation anymore. I picked up the cup and turned toward the door, moving toward the dining room where Ethan was waiting. Rachel made no move to stop me, but I could feel her eyes following me, her presence pressing down on me like a weight. The closer I got to the dining room, the heavier the air became. I was so close now. This was it. I pushed the door open slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. Ethan was sitting at the table, his phone in his hand, staring down at it as though he didn't notice I had entered. Rachel was still behind me, lingering in the hallway, watching everything unfold. For a moment, I thought about turning back. I thought about abandoning the plan, about letting them win. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. I had to know the truth. With a calmness I didn't feel, I moved toward the table, my steps measured, controlled. I placed the coffee cup gently in front of Ethan. His eyes flickered up to meet mine, and for the briefest moment, I saw something shift in his expression. A flicker of surprise? Maybe? Or was it panic? Here, I said, trying to sound casual. I thought you might want to try it. Ethan looked down at the cup, his brow furrowing slightly. You didn't drink it? I shook my head, my gaze never leaving his. Not yet. I figured I'd let you have the first taste. After all, you're the one who made it. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared at the cup for a moment, as if weighing his options. But I could tell something was bothering him. He was hesitating, and I wasn't sure if it was because he was caught off guard or if he was trying to figure out how much I knew. Finally, he reached for the cup. His fingers brushed against the ceramic, and for a brief second, I thought he might stop. But then he lifted the cup to his lips, and I held my breath, watching every movement. The seconds stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. He took a sip, just a small one, but enough for me to see the reaction in his eyes. His expression faltered, his mouth opening slightly as if searching for words, but no sound came out. He set the cup down on the table with a little too much force, his eyes darting between Rachel and me. What's wrong? I asked, my voice steady, even though my heart was hammering in my chest. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He just sat there, staring at the cup as if trying to make sense of what had just happened. And in that silence, I knew I had switched the cups. I knew what was happening now. Rachel stepped into the room then, her voice light, almost too light. What's going on, Ethan? She asked, but there was a slight edge to her tone. She knew something was wrong, too. Ethan's gaze snapped to her, his face pale. I didn't. He looked back at me, his eyes wide with realization. That wasn't supposed to happen. Rachel moved toward the table, her steps deliberate, as if she were trying to regain control of the situation. What do you mean? She asked, her voice dangerously calm. I couldn't contain the words any longer. It was supposed to be for me, wasn't it? I said, my voice sharp. This whole thing, this whole plan. It was for me all along. Ethan's face flushed, and I saw it then. The panic, the fear, the realization that their plan had backfired. I had done it. I had finally done it. Rachel's eyes flickered to Ethan, her expression betraying nothing. She was calm on the surface, but I could see it. The subtle tremor in her hand as she reached for the coffee cup I had so carefully switched. She didn't know what to do now. They had lost control, and they knew it. Ethan stood up quickly, his chair scraping against the floor. Nina, stop, he muttered under his breath, his voice barely a whisper. But it was too late. I had seen enough. I had heard enough. You're not going to get away with this, I said, my voice firm. The truth was finally out. The room felt like it was spinning, and for a moment, I couldn't tell if it was my heart racing or the sudden rush of adrenaline making everything blur. The truth was out now. There was no turning back. I had caught them in the act. Caught Ethan and Rachel red-handed, tangled in their own web of lies. The weight of it hit me all at once, crashing over me like a wave. I could feel my legs shaking, my hands trembling slightly, but I didn't let it show. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me fall apart. Ethan was still standing by the table, staring at me with wide, panic-stricken eyes. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected me to be one step ahead, to figure it out before he and Rachel could carry out their plan. I could feel the shift in the air, the way their entire demeanor changed in the space of a few seconds. The confidence they'd once held so easily had shattered, leaving only fear and desperation in its wake. Rachel's face, on the other hand, was harder to read. She stood there, her arms crossed over her chest, trying to appear calm, but I could see the slight twitch in her jaw, the way her fingers clenched tightly. She was trying to maintain control, trying to act like this was still part of the plan. But I could tell it was too late for that. The mask had slipped, and now I could see her for what she truly was. I took a slow step toward them, my gaze flickering between Ethan and Rachel. I could feel the weight of their eyes on me, but I didn't flinch. I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't the same person I had been when I walked into this house this morning. I had come here, trusting them, believing the lies they'd told me. But now I knew better. Now I knew that everything they had done was part of a carefully orchestrated plot, designed to hurt me, to break me down. And I wasn't going to let them get away with it. Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. His lips moved, but no sound followed. It was as if he didn't know where to start, didn't know how to explain himself. I didn't give him the chance. I wasn't going to let him justify what he had done. Not now. No, I said sharply, my voice steady and unyielding. I don't want to hear your excuses. I don't want to hear why you did this, or what you were hoping to accomplish. I want the truth. The whole truth. Rachel's eyes flickered toward Ethan, her gaze calculating, as if weighing her options. She could see that I wasn't going to back down. She could see that I was already a step ahead, and it terrified her. She straightened her back, her shoulders tense, as if preparing for a fight. But the coldness in her expression didn't fool me. I could see the fear in her eyes now, the cracks in her armor. And that was all I needed. This was never about just poisoning you, was it? I said, my voice cutting through the silence. It was about control, power. You both wanted to take everything from me. My career, my happiness, my sense of security. You thought you could break me with a few little accidents, a few poisoned cups of coffee and tea. But you were wrong. Ethan looked away, his eyes dropping to the floor as if he couldn't bear to meet my gaze. The guilt was written all over him now, plain as day. But Rachel, she held her ground. Her expression remained cold, detached. She wasn't going to give me the satisfaction of seeing her squirm. But I could see it in her posture, the way her arms tightened around her chest. She was uncomfortable, and it was the first time I had ever seen her like this. It was the first time I had ever seen Rachel vulnerable. You don't know what you're talking about, Rachel finally said, her voice steady but laced with a hint of uncertainty. This isn't what you think it is. I shook my head slowly, letting the silence stretch between us. No, Rachel. I know exactly what this is. You and Ethan have been planning this for months. Haven't you? Ever since I started outshining you at work. Ever since I started getting the clients you've been chasing for years. That's what this is really about, isn't it? You were willing to go to any lengths to make sure I wouldn't succeed. You wanted me to fail. Her eyes narrowed, the icy calm returning to her features. You're wrong. You have no idea what you're saying. Don't lie to me, I snapped, taking another step closer. I've seen the messages. The ones between you and Ethan. The ones you thought I didn't know about. You planned this. Every last detail. The tea, the breakfast, the coffee today. All of it was meant to make me sick. To destroy me. Rachel's lips tightened into a thin line. But she didn't deny it. She didn't have to. I could see the truth in her eyes. I could see the faintest flicker of guilt hidden beneath the surface. The cracks in her perfect facade. And I knew then that I had won. I had exposed them for what they were. Ethan's voice broke through the tension. It wasn't supposed to be like this, he said, his voice shaky. We just wanted to make you sick enough so that you'd miss the board meeting next week. You were supposed to take a day off to seem unreliable. But it wasn't supposed to go this far. We didn't mean for you to find out. I swear, it wasn't supposed to happen like this. His words hit me like a slap. The board meeting. The one where I was supposed to present my proposal to land a major client. The one that Rachel had been gunning for months. That was the plan. To make me look weak, to make me miss the meeting so Rachel could take the credit. I stood there for a long moment, taking it all in. The betrayal, the lies, the manipulation. It was too much to process, but at the same time, it felt like a weight lifting off my chest. I finally had the answers I had been searching for. I finally understood why they had been acting so strangely. Why Ethan had been distant and Rachel had been cold. They had been plotting against me, and I had been blind to it. But not anymore. I looked at Ethan, my heart sinking as I saw the regret in his eyes. He had been a part of this too. He had helped Rachel. He had let her manipulate him, let her drag him into her scheme. And now it was too late for apologies. Too late for excuses. You both are pathetic, I said, my voice cold with fury. You thought you could control me, break me down, but you were wrong. You've underestimated me, and now you're going to pay the price for it. Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came out. Rachel didn't even flinch. She just stood there, her arms crossed, her eyes locked on mine. But I knew now. I knew everything. And they were finally going to face the consequences of their actions. In that moment, I felt a surge of power, of confidence. I had taken control of my own story, and I wasn't going to let them dictate it anymore. They had tried to ruin me, but I wasn't going to let them win. Not now. Not ever. The silence that followed my words was thick and suffocating. For a moment, neither Ethan nor Rachel spoke. The tension in the room seemed to stretch out, like an invisible force binding us all together in this moment of truth. The coldness in my veins felt like a quiet victory, but it also came with a sharp pang of disbelief. How could they have done this? How could the two people I trusted most in the world be capable of such cruelty? Ethan stood frozen by the table, his face ashen, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. The man I had loved, the man I had married, was a stranger to me now. I could see the guilt in his eyes, the recognition that everything he had done had led us to this moment. But guilt wasn't enough. Guilt didn't erase the damage they had done. Guilt didn't fix the years of manipulation, the quiet poison they had slipped into my life, literally and figuratively. Rachel, on the other hand, hadn't moved. Her posture remained rigid, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her eyes were still locked on mine, though they no longer carried the cool detachment I had seen earlier. There was something else there now, something raw, something darker. I could see the edges of her confidence beginning to unravel, the cracks widening as the weight of the truth bore down on her. But despite it all, she wasn't going to make this easy for me. She wasn't going to give me the satisfaction of seeing her break. After what felt like an eternity, Rachel finally spoke, her voice colder than before, but tinged with an unmistakable edge of desperation. "You have no idea what you're talking about," she said. Her words clipped, almost robotic. "You think you know everything, but you don't. You don't understand what we've been trying to do." I took a slow, deliberate step toward her, my eyes never leaving hers. My heart was racing, but my voice was steady. "What are you trying to do, Rachel? What's the plan here? You were going to poison me, make me sick, ruin my career, all so you could take what was mine. You thought you could push me out, make me disappear. But you were wrong. You didn't count on me figuring it out." Rachel's gaze flickered, a brief moment of vulnerability before she quickly masked it. "You think this is all about you?" she spat, her voice rising in anger. "You think I did this because I'm jealous of you? You have no idea what I've been through. You've always been the golden girl, the one everyone loves. But I've been stuck in your shadow, watching you get everything while I got nothing." Her words were bitter, dripping with resentment. But there was something else in her voice, a sharp edge of pain, the kind that comes from years of festering jealousy and unspoken hurt. I had never truly understood it before, had never seen it from her perspective. But now, with the weight of everything unfolding around us, I realized just how deep her bitterness ran. She wasn't just trying to tear me down. She was trying to destroy everything I had built, because in her mind, I had everything she could never have. I couldn't help the flicker of sympathy that briefly tugged at my heart. But that feeling was quickly overshadowed by the anger and betrayal that surged to the forefront. "So what? You thought poisoning me would make you feel better?" I asked, my voice thick with disbelief. "That's your solution? You thought this would make you feel more powerful, more important?" Rachel's lips curled into a cruel smile, but it wasn't one of triumph. It was one of bitterness, of someone who had been worn down by years of resentment. "You don't get it, do you?" she said, her voice low and steady now, the venom of her earlier words replaced by a cold calm. "This was never about making me feel better. It was about control, power. You've always had the upper hand, and I've always been the one left behind, overlooked. So yes, I poisoned you. I made sure you'd miss that board meeting, that you'd look weak, unreliable. And it would have worked too, if you hadn't ruined everything." I took another step forward, my mind reeling. "And Ethan? How could you do this with him? How could you involve him in your sick game?" Rachel didn't flinch. Instead, her gaze flickered briefly to Ethan, who had been standing silently by the table, his eyes cast downward in shame. He wasn't exactly an unwilling participant, she said, her voice laced with bitterness. He wanted to help me. He was tired of watching you win, tired of being second place. He didn't want you to succeed. He wanted you out of the picture so he could finally have what you had. Ethan's head snapped up at her words, his expression one of shock. No, he said, his voice hoarse, trembling. That's not. But Rachel cut him off, her eyes narrowing as she turned to face him. It's the truth, Ethan. You wanted this. You wanted to bring her down. Don't pretend like you didn't. You were just as desperate as I was. And now look where we are. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Ethan, the man I had spent 3 years of my life with, the man I had trusted with my heart and soul, had been part of this betrayal from the very beginning. He had been complicit in the plan to poison me, to ruin me. And now, here he was, trying to pretend that he was innocent, that he didn't know what Rachel had been doing. Ethan, is that true? I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Did you really help her? Did you really want to destroy me? For the first time, Ethan didn't look me in the eye. He looked down at his feet, his face pale, his body stiff. I didn't want it to go this far, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to hurt you, but couldn't stop her. She was always so determined. She wouldn't listen. She said if we could just make you sick enough, if you missed that meeting, everything would fall into place. I just wanted to make things right. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. He had known. He had been a willing participant in this nightmare. And now all of his apologies, all of his excuses, felt like empty words. There was no redemption for him. Not now. Rachel stepped forward, her gaze never leaving mine. You think you're the victim here? She asked, her voice laced with derision. You think you're the only one who's suffered? You don't know what it's like to always be in someone else's shadow, to always be the one overlooked, the one pushed aside. You don't know what it's like to be constantly second place. This was my chance to finally be seen. Her words hit me like a slap. The truth was raw and painful, and I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me. Rachel hadn't done this because she hated me. She hadn't done this because she wanted to see me fail. She had done this because she was broken, because she felt worthless and invisible. But that didn't make what she had done right. It didn't make it any less unforgivable. I'm sorry, Ethan said suddenly, his voice cracking. I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to go this far, I swear. I never thought it would end up like this. I didn't want to lose you. His words were a mixture of guilt, shame, and regret. But they did nothing to heal the wounds they had both caused. How could he be sorry now? After everything they had done? After everything they had planned? You should have thought about that before you decided to betray me, I said quietly, my voice steady now, the anger giving way to a quiet, painful resolve. Both of you. The room was silent after that, the weight of Rachel's confession hanging in the air. Ethan's head remained bowed, and Rachel's eyes flickered with a mix of guilt and defiance. The truth had come out, but it wasn't enough to fix the damage they had done. It wasn't enough to undo the betrayal, to erase the hurt. But it was the first step. And for me, that was all that mattered. The storm inside me had calmed, but the reality of what had happened still loomed large. There was no going back from this. No pretending it hadn't happened. But as I stood there, facing the two people who had once been my family, I knew one thing for sure. I was stronger than they ever thought I could be, and I wasn't going to let them tear me down. I'm done, I said, turning toward the door. I'm done with both of you. And with that, I walked out of the room, leaving behind the wreckage of my past and stepping into the future, one that was mine to control. The moment I stepped out of that room, the weight of everything pressing down on me felt unbearable. My body felt like it was moving through thick molasses, every step slow and deliberate, as if I were dragging my entire life behind me. I could hear the faint murmur of voices behind me. Ethan's broken apologies, Rachel's sharp, venomous words, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. Not now. I made my way down the hallway, my heart thudding in my chest, my mind racing with everything I had just uncovered. The betrayal, the lies, the manipulation, it was all too much to process. I wanted to scream, to lash out, but the weight of what had happened left me numb. The anger had become a dull ache, a distant throb that I wasn't ready to face just yet. Not when everything was still so raw. As I reached the front door, my hand trembled on the doorknob. The outside world seemed so far away, so distant, like a place where nothing bad could happen. But I wasn't there yet. I wasn't free yet. I stepped outside, letting the cool air hit my face, trying to shake off the heaviness that clung to me. My breath came in sharp gasps, and for a moment, I was afraid I might collapse right there on the front step. But I didn't. I had to keep moving. I pulled out my phone with shaky hands, scrolling through my contacts, looking for someone to call. My mind raced through possibilities, but all I could think of was one number: 911. I needed help. I needed to make sure that what had just happened didn't go unnoticed, that Rachel and Ethan didn't get away with this. I hit dial and the phone rang once, twice, before a voice on the other end answered. 911. What's your emergency? Please, I said, my voice trembling but firm. I need an ambulance. There's been an incident. Someone may be poisoned. I need immediate help. The dispatcher's voice was calm but urgent, asking for my location, the nature of the situation, and my name. I rattled off the address as quickly as I could, my words coming in a rush, my heart still pounding in my chest. Stay with me, the dispatcher said. Help is on the way. Can you tell me what happened? I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself. I had to keep it together. I had to stay focused. My sister-in-law, she drank something she shouldn't have. I think it's poisoning. I think she might be in serious trouble. Stay with her. Stay on the line. The ambulance will be there shortly. I clutched the phone to my ear, waiting for the sirens, waiting for something to happen, but it felt like the world had gone still. Time slowed, every second stretching out painfully as I stood there, frozen. I didn't know what to do next. Should I go back inside? Should I wait for the ambulance to arrive? My legs felt like lead, my thoughts scattered in a million directions. But one thing was certain. I couldn't go back into that house. Not yet. Not while the truth was still so fresh, so ugly. A few minutes later, I heard it. The distant sound of sirens wailing through the air, growing louder with each passing second. Relief flooded through me, but it was quickly followed by dread. What would I find when they arrived? What would happen to Rachel? To Ethan? I turned and watched the road, my eyes scanning for the flashing lights, for the paramedics who would be able to help. The air felt heavy, thick with the weight of everything that had just unfolded. My life had changed in a way I could never have imagined, and I wasn't sure I was ready for the fallout. But there was no turning back now. The ambulance pulled up in front of the house, its lights flashing, the sirens blaring. I felt a chill run through me, but I didn't hesitate. I walked toward the vehicle, stepping out of the shadows and into the light of the street lamps. A paramedic approached me immediately, his eyes scanning me for any signs of distress. "Are you the one who called?" he asked, his voice calm but urgent. "Yes," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "My sister-in-law, she's inside. She drank something that made her sick. I don't know what it was, but it was something from the coffee. The coffee I think she drank. It's poisoning." The paramedic nodded, his expression serious. "We'll take care of her. Can you show us where she is?" I nodded, turning to lead him back to the house. As we approached the door, I paused. I couldn't help but glance back at the front yard, the house looming behind me like a silent witness to everything that had transpired. I didn't know if I could ever go back there, not without confronting everything that had happened. Inside, Rachel was slumped over the kitchen table, her body trembling uncontrollably, her face pale as a sheet. She had tried to sit up when I arrived, but the tremors were too much for her. Ethan was standing nearby, his face frozen in shock, his hands wringing together nervously. He didn't look like the man I had married. He looked like someone completely different, someone who had been caught in a lie so big that there was no way out. Is Is she going to be okay? I asked the paramedic, my voice barely above a whisper. The paramedic didn't answer immediately. Instead, he bent down beside Rachel, checking her pulse, his hands moving with practiced precision. The tension in the room was palpable, and it felt like every breath I took was a fight. I was terrified, but there was no way I could show it. Not here, not now. We're going to do everything we can, the paramedic said finally, his voice calm but firm. We'll get her stabilized and take her to the hospital. We need to act quickly. Please, I whispered, my throat tight. Please, just make sure she's okay. The paramedic gave me a brief nod before turning back to Rachel, his focus completely on her now. The rest of the world seemed to fall away as they moved with efficient urgency, lifting Rachel onto the stretcher and carefully securing her for transport. I stepped back, my heart heavy in my chest. I couldn't look at Ethan. I couldn't face him, not yet. The sound of the stretcher wheels rolling across the floor was the only thing that filled the silence as the paramedics moved Rachel toward the door. The flashing lights of the ambulance outside filled the room with a harsh, artificial light that only heightened the sense of dread. I was still trying to wrap my mind around everything that had happened, but it felt like it was slipping through my fingers. Ethan stepped forward, his voice cracking. Christina, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. You have to believe me. I didn't want this. I never wanted to hurt you. But his words fell on deaf ears. They were hollow, meaningless. They didn't change what had happened. They didn't change the fact that I had seen the truth, that I had lived the truth. I stepped out of the way as the paramedics loaded Rachel into the ambulance, her body still trembling with the effects of whatever poison she had ingested. I had no idea what would happen to her, to me, to us. The whole thing felt like a nightmare, a twisted game of trust and betrayal that had spiraled out of control. As the doors of the ambulance slammed shut, I felt a pang in my chest. Was I relieved to see her taken away? Or was there something else there? Something I couldn't explain? I didn't know. All I knew was that things would never be the same. I turned to face Ethan, my eyes hard, my resolve solidifying with each passing second. There was no going back. This was the end of everything I had known. The end of the lies, the end of the deceit. And as much as it hurt, as much as I wished things had been different, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't let him, either of them, hold power over me any longer. I stepped back into the night, the ambulance fading into the distance, and felt a shift inside me. I was done being the victim. I was done letting their lies define me. And no matter what happened next, I knew I was strong enough to face it. The days that followed were a blur, a mix of numbness and clarity, as I tried to process everything that had happened. The world outside seemed so far removed from the chaos that had unfolded in that house. Yet every corner of my mind was consumed by the events that had turned my life upside down. Rachel was in the hospital, and the doctors were working to stabilize her, but I didn't know what to feel anymore. Should I be relieved that she was getting the help she needed? Or should I feel angry, betrayed beyond repair by the very people I had trusted most? The ambulance had whisked Rachel away, but the weight of the truth was still crushing me. I had finally seen the real faces behind the facade they had built. Ethan, my husband, the man I had shared my life with, and Rachel, my sister-in-law, the one I had believed was family. They were both complicit in a conspiracy so dark, so twisted, that I couldn't find the words to express the depth of my hurt. It wasn't just the poisoning, the manipulation. It was the deceit, the quiet way they had chipped away at everything I had worked for. The betrayal had stained every moment I had spent with them. Ethan had left the house shortly after Rachel was taken to the hospital, his face drawn and pale, his words stammering in my ears like a broken record. But I couldn't bring myself to listen. There was nothing he could say that would fix what had been broken. His apologies felt empty, his explanations hollow. They were just words that couldn't erase the damage that had already been done. I spent hours pacing the empty house, my thoughts spiraling in every direction. I couldn't focus. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened to Rachel, about what would happen next. The police had arrived soon after the paramedics, taking my statement and collecting evidence from the house. But even as I spoke to them, I felt disconnected, as if I were watching everything unfold from a distance, unable to truly grasp the enormity of it all. The detectives were thorough, asking about the events leading up to Rachel's illness, about the coffee, about the strange incidents that had occurred in the past. They were polite, professional, but I could see the questions in their eyes. Why hadn't I suspected sooner? Why hadn't I known what was happening right under my nose? I didn't have answers. All I could do was give them the facts. The things I had witnessed, the moments of suspicion that had been too fleeting to make sense of until now. I could see it in their faces, the disbelief, the shock that something so sinister could be happening in such an ordinary setting. But I wasn't surprised anymore. In a way, I had always known that something wasn't right. I just hadn't been able to see it clearly, not until it was too late. As the evening drew on, I finally collapsed onto the couch, my mind exhausted, my body aching with the weight of everything. Couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, Ethan, his expression pleading, and Rachel, her defiance thinly veiled behind a mask of cold indifference. I couldn't stop hearing her words, the venom in her voice when she admitted everything. She had been so sure of herself, so convinced that what she was doing was justified. But what had it all been for? To bring me down? To break me? To take what I had? I thought about calling a lawyer, about starting the long process of filing for divorce. But even as the thought crossed my mind, I realized that it wasn't just about ending my marriage with Ethan. It was about reclaiming my life, about putting an end to the lies that had held me captive for so long. I had trusted them. I had believed in them. And now, I was left with the wreckage of a life I had thought was solid, the pieces scattered and broken, unable to be put back together. The next morning, I received a call from the hospital. It was the doctor, calling to update me on Rachel's condition. I braced myself for the news, unsure of what I would hear. But when the doctor spoke, it was with a calmness that surprised me. "She's stable," the doctor said. "We were able to flush the toxins from her system, and she's responding to treatment. It looks like she'll make a full recovery, but we'll need to monitor her closely for the next few days." I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. Part of me had feared the worst, had feared that Rachel might not make it through, that I would be left with nothing but guilt and unanswered questions. But the news wasn't as bad as I had imagined. Rachel would be okay, physically at least. But emotionally, mentally, I wasn't sure. And I wasn't sure I cared. The woman who had done this to me, who had tried to destroy everything I held dear, wasn't someone I wanted to save. She had crossed a line that I couldn't unsee, a line that could never be erased. The doctor continued, explaining the next steps, asking if I wanted to speak with Rachel when she woke up. But I was already shaking my head. I didn't know what I would say to her. What could I say? The words wouldn't come. It was as if everything between us had turned to dust, a relationship built on lies and manipulation, nothing more than a facade. I had nothing left to say. The days dragged on. I went through the motions of handling the aftermath, talking to my lawyer, arranging for the divorce, and dealing with the police investigation. But all of it felt like a blur. There were so many details, so many things to take care of, but none of it seemed to matter. I was numb. The weight of the betrayal of everything that had happened was still crushing me. It was hard to even look at my phone without feeling like I was being suffocated by the weight of unanswered messages, of calls I didn't want to take. I thought about going to see Rachel, about confronting her in person, but the thought filled me with a kind of dread I couldn't explain. What would I say to her? What would be the point? We were no longer family. I had lost everything that had once tied us together, and there was nothing left to salvage. My life had been turned upside down, and I had to rebuild it from the ground up. I didn't know where to start or if I even wanted to, but I knew I couldn't stay in the house any longer. The memories were too fresh, too painful. I had to leave. I packed a few bags, leaving behind everything I thought I would need, everything I had grown comfortable with. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay here, not with the ghosts of what had happened still haunting every room. As I locked the door behind me, I felt a sense of finality settle in my chest. This was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The road ahead was uncertain, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let them control my story anymore. I was done with the lies, done with the betrayal, and most importantly, I was done with them. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I was strong enough to face it. The days that followed felt like an endless stretch of quiet. The world outside had moved on, as it always does, but for me, time had slowed to a crawl. I had walked away from everything I had once known. My marriage, my home, my life as I had built it. But despite the storm that had swept through my world, a strange calm had settled in its place. It was a quiet kind of strength, the kind that rises after the dust has settled and the wreckage has been cleared away. I didn't know where I was going or what I would do next, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally free. Free from the lies, free from the manipulation, free from the toxic grip that had held me in place for so long. And while the pain of betrayal still lingered, there was a sense of relief too, a sense that I had reclaimed my own life. One that didn't involve living in the shadows of those who had tried to control me. I spent the first few weeks in a haze of numbness. There was so much to process, so many emotions that I had pushed aside in order to survive. But now, with the noise of the world around me quieted, I had no choice but to face the wreckage, to sift through the pieces and try to make sense of them. What had gone wrong? How had I missed it? How had I let myself fall into the trap of trust and comfort, only to have it shattered so violently? I thought about Rachel often. Despite everything she had done, despite the poison she had slipped into my life, there was a part of me that still couldn't quite let go of the sister-in-law I had once known. The Rachel who had smiled at me across the dinner table, the one who had offered advice when I needed it, the one who had been there during the small, quiet moments of my life. How could that person have been the same one who had plotted my downfall? It didn't make sense. And yet it did. It was a bitter truth, one that I had to swallow even as it left a sour taste in my mouth. I thought about Ethan too, about the man I had married, the one I had trusted with my heart and my future. How had I been so blind? How had I let him pull the wool over my eyes for so long? There were so many moments now, so many red flags that I had ignored. The late-night phone calls, the quiet conversations between him and Rachel, the subtle changes in his behavior that should have tipped me off. But I had been too trusting, too comfortable in my own world to see what was happening around me. And now, the trust that had once been the foundation of our relationship was gone, shattered into a million tiny pieces that could never be put back together. But as I sat in the quiet of my new apartment, I realized something. This wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning. The truth had been exposed, and though it had torn my life apart, it had also given me the chance to rebuild, to start fresh, to take control of my own future. The first few days in my new place had been hard. I had never been the type of person who liked change. I had always found comfort in the familiar, in the routine. But now, I had no choice but to adapt, to create a new routine, a new life for myself. And slowly, as the days turned into weeks, I began to settle in. The unfamiliarity of the apartment became less daunting, and I found small comforts in the newness of it all. The way the sunlight filtered through the windows in the morning, the quiet hum of the city outside, the solitude that felt both peaceful and terrifying. I started to take time for myself, to rediscover who I was without the weight of Ethan and Rachel's influence hanging over me. I started doing the things I had always wanted to do but had put off. Reading the books I had neglected, taking long walks in the park, cooking meals that made me feel good. I went back to my career, diving into work with a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't easy, but I had found strength in the process. Each day was a small victory, a reminder that I could rebuild. I wasn't the person I had been before, and I didn't want to be. I had become something stronger, something wiser, something more resilient. The hardest part, though, was the loneliness. It wasn't just the physical absence of people. It was the emotional space they had once occupied, the gaps they had left behind. I missed the companionship I had once shared with Ethan, the quiet moments of connection we had built over time. But I didn't miss the lies. I didn't miss the games they had played, the way they had manipulated me to get what they wanted. That was the truth I had to hold on to. No matter how much I missed the illusion of our life together, I could never go back to it. The foundation of that life had been built on lies, And once the truth came to light, it was impossible to ignore. I found myself thinking about the future more and more. What would I do next? How would I move forward from here? The possibilities were both terrifying and exhilarating. I didn't know what the next chapter would hold, but I knew I would write it myself. No one else would have the power to dictate my future. Not Rachel, not Ethan, not anyone. And then one day the call came. It was from the police. They had completed their investigation, and they had news about Rachel and Ethan. It wasn't unexpected, but hearing it out loud was still a shock. Rachel was facing charges for attempted poisoning, and Ethan had been complicit in the crime. The legal process was moving forward, and it looked like they would both be held accountable for what they had done. The news didn't bring me the closure I had hoped for. I had imagined that hearing the truth would somehow make everything easier, but it didn't. The wounds didn't magically heal just because justice was being served. But as I sat in silence, processing everything, I realized that it didn't matter. The closure I had been waiting for was something I had to give to myself. The truth had come out. Rachel and Ethan were being held accountable for their actions. And now it was time for me to move forward. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew one thing. I was done being the victim. I had taken back my power, and no one could take it from me again. I was stronger than I had ever been before, and I was ready to face whatever came next. The world was wide open now. The possibilities were endless. And for the first time in years, I could breathe freely, knowing that the choices I made from here on out would be my own. I didn't know where life would take me. I didn't know what the future held. But for the first time, I was excited to find out.